everyone. Welcome again to Novelists Unwind. I'm Johnny Alexander. I'm so glad to be here today with Thomas Locke, who's actually Davis Bunn. He is just a wonderful writer. He has written over 70 books, 7 million books sold worldwide, been translated into 22 languages, and just lives an incredible life. So we're going to talk to him today about writing and about some of his adventures, and also get some advice for those of us who are still pretty new in that writing journey. So welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
You are very welcome. It's great to be here.
I appreciate it. I just wanted to start out though with one little background thing I read on your website, where you talk about being a 16-year-old surfer dude because you surfed competitively, and with your first job, the chef was a murderer. Is that right?
Yeah, convicted murderer.
Oh my goodness. What was that like?
It wasn't my first job. It was my first gig as a waiter. I started working actually as a dock boy when I was 11 years old at a marina in Kill Devil Hills, North Carolina, down on the Outer Banks. And when I was 17, so a year earlier than I was supposed to, I got a job working as a waiter at a very upscale restaurant in the Nags Head area of North Carolina. And I walked into the kitchen the first evening, I had no idea. I'd never waited tables before. I didn't know anything about this. And there was this massive guy, and there's this steel table or counter that runs the length of the kitchen. And this is true for most restaurants, most commercial restaurants.
Sure.
And you walk in and there's a shelf where you put in the new orders. Nowadays, you'll do it by computer, but back then it was by a slip of paper that he had to be able to. And then there's the biggest stove, the central stove, is directly behind the counter, and then everything else is split up into sections going away from this first station, the first station in the kitchen. And the head chef is the guy who mans this first stove, which is the stoves, the ovens, and then it's like everybody else it's basically his squad. It's very military in most kitchens. And for a lot of these experienced and high-paid chefs, they're loud, there's a lot of cursing, they're shouting all the time. And this is true in the really big Michelin-starred restaurants. Jamie Oliver, if you've ever seen him on his show, that's very typical, that hostility and aggressiveness. This was the quietest kitchen I have ever been in. So everybody was terrified of this guy, and I had no idea why, except that he was very big and very black. But it turned out that at the end of the day, he got in his little car and he drove away. Didn't say anything to anybody, just got in his car and drove away. And then the next day, he came in, and everybody was waiting outside the kitchen for him to come in. He sort of led them in and got them started. And we'd been there, I think, about a week before I finally learned that he was on parole, and he was going back to spend his night in the prison in Elizabeth City.
Oh my gosh.
And the only reason that they had gotten this arrangement was because the owner of the restaurant was also a member of the governor's cabinet. He was a legislator. He had worked out this deal. The guy could not, he was a convicted murderer, but he was also a great cook.
Did he ever end up as a character in one of your books?
Not yet. It's been a little scary, you know. I don't know what happened to him, and I'd hate to have to come looking for this.
Oh man, it's a great story though.
Oh gosh.
And you do live a rather adventurous life, dividing your time between Florida and England and doing all kinds of amazing trips. I love looking at your photos.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that's great. So it's true that you live in a butler's flat? I love that too.
We used to live out in a very tiny village in the Cotswolds, a place called Charlton, which was it was 18 houses. It was, for us, it was just idyllic. We lived there for 12 years. And the closest shopping area was the town of Cirencester, which was the westernmost capital, provincial capital in the Roman Empire. And
Oh,
still
wow.
had the arena, the Roman arena, and a lot of the streets still had sections that had the Roman paving stones in the center of it. And then it became a center of the medieval wool trades. And so it was just this, for us, it was both in terms of my art and also my wife's work. It was just really wonderful. We just loved it. But at the time, it worked because we only had to be in Oxford, where I'm writer in residence at the Baptist College and my wife teaches. We were only going in one day a week. Mm. But by the end of that time, Isabella's work had gotten to the point where she was going in 5 days a week, every day. And then by Saturday, she was just gray with exhaustion. It's a 90-minute commute each way.
Oh, wow.
And we had to, and there was no public transport. So we had to quit, we had to leave. And Oxford is a difficult place for a number of reasons. It's not, it is not just a university town. It's sort of like Boston and Cambridge, Harvard and Radcliffe are across the river. In Oxford's case, there's this enclave, very tight in the middle of the town. The center of Oxford is dominated by the university, but surrounding this is a real industrial zone, very hardcore, very much like Boston. Oxford is the second largest producer of motor vehicles in Europe. And so the problems that you have with industrial, you know, I mean, if you think about the problems in Detroit, obviously it's a very wealthy town, but the issues in the industrial zones outside of town are very similar. And so everybody who's involved with the university wants to live in the center of town, which means that the cost of a place inside the safe zones of Oxford is as expensive as Central Park West in
oh, wow.
To buy just a regular apartment, let's see, it would be $1,600 a square foot with the.
Oh my gosh! Wow.
So we rented a double-wide garage that had been converted into a studio apartment for a year and a half, and then. You know, because we're paying rent for the time that we're in the United States as well. Isabella teaches 1 term a year over here. And then we found this place through the university. They were the Blenheim Palace, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The birthplace of Churchill, Winston Churchill. And it's the largest palace in Europe. It's larger than Versailles. The Palace of Blenheim is run by this estate, which is actually controlled by the House of Lords. They sent this formal request to their closest friends in the Oxford University community saying, we're looking for a trustworthy rental occupant.
And you said, I'm trustworthy.
You know, we can't have pets. Can't have kids, there's no garage, there's no garden, and it's at the top of, they say it's at the top of 1 flight of stairs, but it's 49 steps. And these are all very old stone steps. So it's like 3.5 floors up. It's a Downton Abbey servants' quarters.
Yeah. Wow.
Very higgledy-piggledy apartment, but it's in the clock tower overlooking the ducal apartment and the main courtyard of Blenheim. So I mean, it's really cool. It's very plain.
That is cool.
But it's really cool.
And not everyone can say that. So I mean, that's like.
Wow.
Really nice.
Wow.
They like us, we're very polite. And
Yes.
they assume we're on the staff because we're going in and out of these doors marked private. As Americans, we're not part of the Duke's family, so we get asked directions all the time. Where can they go for tea? It's really great, and we're
That's fun.
bus ride from the college. So
That's really fun, though. I mean, again, just what an amazing experience to have. It's cool. So, talking about
30 seconds to volunteer.
Yeah. Talking about your books and about writing, you've had, of course, quite the successful career. Again, I'm a little bit starstruck, even just to be doing the interview. You've been really great at writing in several different genres, though, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Can I ask what genre you work in?
Yeah, kind of where I'm going with this. My first book was a historical, and then I also have a novella in a collection. And then my last three were a series of contemporary romances with Ravel. And now I'm writing 2 cozy mysteries. So I'm sort of like hopping all over the place. And I know that's usually not recommended, but it's the doors God has opened for me. So those are the doors I have gone through. But what would be your advice to someone like that, or at this stage in a person's writing career, or even earlier for new writers looking for advice about genres and picking that genre and whether or not to stick with it?
Okay, the issue is not so much genre as brand.
Okay.
I think I need to give a bit of explanation as to how my background worked here.
I'd love that. Thank you.
Okay. I wrote for 9 years and finished 7 books before my first was accepted for publication. My first 2 were science fiction, which was my passion as a kid. But I knew by this point already that if possible, I wanted to write where there was an element of faith in my stories. And there was no science fiction being published at that time. We're talking now of the late 80s in the CBA. That science fiction and fantasy didn't exist. The last fantasy novel published by a Christian publisher, I think at that point, was still Narnia.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
40 years earlier or 35 years earlier. And so I switched to, and I'd been very interested in contemporary dramas, just from the standpoint of being a reader. So I wrote a couple of those, and that was where I had the first glimmer of the indication from the broader community that I really had the talent and it looked like I was going to get published. And then I wrote a political drama called The Presence, which was acquired by Bethany, which is another imprint like Ravel. And it became an ECPA Gold Medallion finalist and was also the Word Book of the Month. The Word had the biggest Christian book club at the time. And so there was like this, and it was a bestseller within the CBA. So there was a sense of having built a sort of direction. But at the time, the Christian publishing of fiction was still small enough that they were not that concerned with branding or genre as they are now. It was like they wanted to try to build me an audience, but it was, and they were sort of expecting they would be contemporary dramas, but this idea of doing political dramas exclusively was not an issue. But then my grandmother, who raised me for a time when I was a child, became critically ill, and I wrote a homily called The Quilt, which was based on her final sort of 3 years of her life. And it was my first major hit. I mean, talking about moving from having a book that actually paid our way to being something that established me as someone that people were talking about. It sold in the end, and it started off, Bethany published 3,000 copies. They thought it was too small to really make a hit. They only did it. It was the first fiction gift book done in the CBA, and
Hmm.
it sold almost 400,000 copies.
Oh my
became-
gosh. Wow.
It became the
Wow.
first novel that was selected as the book for Lent by the Anglican Church of England. It was just this amazing.
That's
gift.
amazing.
And so all of a sudden,
Wow.
I was like,
You arrived.
yeah, I was established in two different genres. I was doing contemporary,
Yes.
not political dramas or mysteries, and I was doing
Ah,
these
that's
women's stories. So
fantastic.
that was one side, and then the other side was I had worked as a consultant, full-time business consultant, during the time that I was trying to start my career. So my early days, this was throughout the time that I was trying to learn how to write, and the first 3.5 years after my first book was published, I was working in 3 and sometimes 4 different countries every week. And
Oh.
the pressure and the need to just, the struggle I had to go through to maintain the writing career was very difficult. So when I was finally able to live from the writing, it was like someone had taken the chains off, and the next 21 months, I wrote 9 full-length novels. And
Wow.
Wow.
that release has been with me ever since. The discipline that I learned during this period of just struggling to hold on to the dream, and getting to that point where it was my only source of income, has meant that for the last 20 years, I write a minimum of 4 full-length projects every year. Now,
That's a lot.
as long as I was, I wrote 14 novels co-authoring with Jeanette Oke. As long as Jeanette and I were writing together, there was that sort of that mask in place. I could do my stories, the political dramas or contemporary dramas, and then I could do these other stories that were with Jeanette. And Jeanette retired 6 years ago, and she retired because of bad health. And one of the things that was really just very intense for me in that period was this question of seeing what Jeanette was going through, and the sense of being forced to accept that her career was effectively ended despite what she might have preferred. And was I satisfied with what I had done? If, God forbid, this were to happen to me at this point, would I be content? And in some respects, yes. In some respects, obviously, as the flawed believer, there's never going to be that sense, I hope, of being, fully content.
Exactly.
But at the same time, there was that feeling of there are several challenges that I really wish I could also take on. And so starting 4 years ago, almost 5 years ago now, I started doing in my quote unquote spare time. And the reason why I had the spare time was because really the publishing world will only accept 2, at the most, in the romance section, you can occasionally do 3 books a year, but 4 books, it was, and really in most cases, they only want 1. And so I was being restricted to, what I could do. And so in my spare time, I was writing books for my first passion as a reader, which is science fiction and fantasy, trying to do stories that had the positive elements, that heroic structure that thrilled me as a kid, and at the same time are stories that are, in terms of tension and action lines and character development, are designed for the readers of today. And the head of Revell's sales division, is actually the head now of the Baker sales team, was a real fan of these early books and took them to Dwight Baker. And Dwight said that he would be willing to give me a chance to publish these if I was to agree to do a pen name and do a minimum of 2 books a year under the pen name, plus the books that I was already doing for Bethany.
Oh, that's quite a, that's a lot of work.
Yes. But it does bring us back to this issue of how are you going to create this sense of branding?
Yeah.
For me, the biggest gift that Revell has given me, other than just working with a phenomenal team, I've never met an author that works with Revell that hasn't said just how
They're great.
they are.
They're great.
They really are. But there was that opportunity, the unexpected opportunity. It was a hope, but it was never something that I thought would ever happen, particularly in a market as difficult as this one, that they would actually come back and say, your conditions are your dream come true. We'll give you a pen name, but you've got to do 2 books a year. It's like, well, can I do 3? So I'm writing the last of them now, but I've done 9 books under the Thomas Lock pen name now.
Wow.
And, just love it. I really do. So to your question, so there's a lot of background information. We've really strayed, but to answer your question, the issue, I think, is that a lot of times when you talk to the publishing house, they are seeing this branding issue or the genre issue only from the standpoint of selling your books.
Mm-hmm.
But you need to establish this from the standpoint of your creative side as well. So there are 2 aspects that you've got to consider. On the one hand, we'll take the creative first. The best way, in my opinion, that you can look at this branding issue is with a pen and paper in your hand and ask yourself the question, where are you today? And this is in terms of what are you writing? What are you writing next? Okay. What is your sales level? What is your relationship inside the publishing house? Realistically, do they consider you a mid-list author? Do they see you as potentially being developed into one of their top hits? These are defining who you are professionally and creatively as an author. Okay, so you have this list, and then you have the next question, which is, where would you like to be in 3 years' time? In the same parallel, what genre would you like to be writing in? What would you like to have as your relationship within the house? How do you see your audience sales levels at this point? Okay. Do you see yourself entering into the film world? And there are specific requirements I've discovered. They're not, no one's going to give you a written list, but there are very specific requirements as to what they want in order to make this happen. So you have these things, where you are now and where you would like to be in 3 years' time. And then you need to ask yourself the third question, and that is, how do you walk? What is the road you follow between now and then? And that, to me, is the definition of your brand.
Okay.
Okay?
Okay.
Creatively, this is your brand. How do you make the bridge from where you are to where you want to be? Okay? Once you have this creative definition in mind, it's much easier to go to the publishing house and say, these are my aims. This is the brand that I see for myself. It's not a genre. It's the definition of you as the author. So
I like that. Yeah.
even if you're doing these huge transitions like John Grisham has done, between legal thrillers and Southern dramas, there's this very clear understanding of what he's doing and who his audience is. John Grisham, for example, is someone that writes primarily in terms of why he is selling 3 to 4 million copies of each of his books is because he appeals to the blue-collar worker who feels alienated by most of the publishing world. The intelligentsia don't apply to this. They're just, I mean, it's nice when people that are well-educated, intellectually, you know, diverse and so forth, read a John Grisham novel, but they buy it with a sense of embarrassment, you know, for the people that his core audience, these are people that, like the Stephen King audience, they are passionate about him, and
They
very
are.
few others. And so this is the definition of the brand, so that you can shift from genre to genre, and you are safe in this because your brand is bigger than that. But you do have to establish that brand.
That gives a fun and nice way to think about it too. And I've tried to do that a little bit, thinking, what do my historicals and contemporaries have in common, to sort of build on that. But I think I need to give that some deeper thought too, and figure that out. Thanks for that. I don't want to take up too much of your time, but you did mention about the film and movies. So can we talk just a little bit about how someone, you said there's specific things that they want, even though there's no list. If someone is interested in writing with that goal in mind, what would be your advice?
Okay, I think the best thing for us to do is to limit ourselves to Hallmark at this stage.
Okay.
What we're really talking about is the buyer.
Yes.
If you, it's sort of like taking aim at the publishing world. As a new author, one of the things that you had to learn was that there were certain expectations within the publishing arena that you never knew until you had made that first, you know, it's not just that you make the presentation, but that they start expressing an interest. Their interest redefines a lot of things in your creative life. If you want to go after the film world, it's something that you actually, in my opinion, you have to make a declaration for. There's even, I mean, okay, I'll give you sort of like because what normally people think about when they think about making in the film world is like, the film world comes looking for you, or they come talking to your agent and say, we want to have read it or something. It used to be that this happened when the baseline, because the only thing that really, if you're talking about working in LA, and it has that cachet, in other words, where they come looking for you, is either one of two things. You are the hot topic. You're doing something that is effectively defining what these people at the top expect the culture to do in the next 2 years, because it's
right
from idea and contract to seeing the film on air. Either that, or it used to be, it was up until the the 2008, 2009 recession, that you need to sell a minimum of 250,000 copies of that book, because what they're looking for is a core audience that they can build upon.
Right, that makes sense, yeah.
2008 changed a lot of things, including the expectations that these people could have for what was to them a solid enough bestseller to justify that investment. Now you need to be over 100,000 copies. If you're not over that, then the question is, how do you get your book noticed? And the answer is, you have to find a group that is looking for content and meet their expectations. So if you're talking about contemporary romance, then the only major buyer out there today is Hallmark. And Hallmark has very specific requirements. They want, it has to be very tightly monitored. And part of it is because Hallmark is so successful that they've become a bully. They're known as that. This is not something that I'm saying out of turn. Everyone who works with them talks about how Hallmark over the last 3 or 4 years has really started taking on some very unpleasant attitudes.
That's sad.
It is.
Yeah.
It's also, I think it's also changing. They've
Mhm.
been the big bully on the block for too long, and there are two new players that are coming up strong. You know, there had been hope that Up Channel was going to be able to do this, and
Mhm.
Freeform, but really the ones that are worrying Hallmark right now are Netflix and Amazon. And
Yes. Yeah.
both of these cases, I think in another year or so, we're going to see a growing number of producers who are challenging Hallmark to the point where they've got to rethink their attitude. But basically at this stage, Hallmark does not acquire purchases directly from authors unless the author is, like, they recently bought a book by David Baldacci.
No.
They're not
Yeah.
at that
Right.
level.
Right.
You are selling your product to producers. And what I have found is that the producers are desperately looking for product that they can take to Hallmark. And what they want, first of all, Hallmark does not buy historical fiction. The only historical fiction they bought in the last 5 years has been the Jeanette Oak series, Wind Calls the Heart. Other than that, everything follows a particular line. And this line is that it has to be upbeat. The characters need to be somewhere in their 30s, late 20s or early 30s. The female is the primary protagonist of the story, and the story needs to be something that holds a dramatic element other than romance, but that feeds into the romance. So there's this very clear-cut formula that allows the Hallmark team to make a decision on the structure of the story on a one-page overview. So when you do your and if you're interested, if your audience expresses an interest, I can supply you with a couple of overviews that have recently been acquired.
Oh, that would be interesting. Yeah.
This is the format that is required to go forward. This is it. And for each of the buyers nowadays, because there's so many people that are trying to get in. I mean, like, for example, you know, there was this talk of how much new content has been desired because Netflix and Amazon are both setting up new television series. But you have to understand the competition for these is really fierce. Like Ridley
I'm sure.
is doing the Amazon series based on one of the early David Brin that wrote, I can't remember. But in any case, the way that they did this and the way that's becoming frequent now within this big budget television construct is that they will develop the pilot script, they will cast it tentatively, and then they will go to the stars that they think would be best in these roles and say, we want you to come in for 3 days of shooting. We're going to shoot a 3-minute component of this. Usually it's 1 day a minute is the basic for.
Oh my gosh.
Wow. So we want to shoot you for 3 days, and we're not going to pay you, but we will give a tentative handshake agreement that if the Netflix or Amazon acquires the project, that we will use you, but they have the final say on the actors. And if they have someone else that they think, you know, no, we like this, but we want so-and-so in place, then we have no choice but to accept that. So
wow.
Competition. The higher the budget, the bigger the investment before the contract is signed. Netflix apparently can take as long as 2 years to okay a script for a pilot. So in each of these, there is a sort of like a pro forma that you have to go through to get this thing running. And Hallmark has its own parameters. The most positive thing I can say about this is that working under this New York Times bestseller level of sales, if you're not Debbie Macomber, this is the way that you go about it, is you are not dealing directly with Hallmark, you are selling to producers. There are 10 or 11 different production teams that Hallmark goes to literally once a month with an offer or so forth. Usually these producers will be doing 2 and sometimes 3 films each year. So they're always looking for content, but it has to be within the Hallmark parameters. It has to be structured around the one-page overview.
Wow, that's terrific information, and certainly a insider's look into a world that I certainly don't know hardly anything about at all. I mean, that's just
the most important thing I think you need to realize is that if you want to do it, you've got to hunt for it. It's not something that will just come to you.
And it's not for the faint of heart either, is it? Yeah. No.
I've been working at this for 8 years, and the thing that we have to remember that's actually, I just had to remind myself today about this, is that you went into it because it was fun. You know, going to LA and meeting with these people, it is very exciting. The nitty-gritty of it can be extremely difficult. Extremely difficult. But
oh my God.
you just have to remember that it's fun. It's fun. You're making, I mean, if it works, you're making a Hallmark movie.
Exactly. And I think one of my contemporaries would be a great Hallmark movie. Of course I do.
There you go.
Yeah. Well,
so
listen.
Email, I will send you a copy of a recent success in terms of selling.
I love that. Wow, that's so cool. Thank you so much. Well, I don't want to take up any more of your time. I know you've got other commitments, but I do have one thing to tell you. Like I said before we recorded, I met you at a couple of the Florida Christian Writers Conferences where you were teaching. So this would have been back in 2008, 2009, somewhere around in there. And I think you had talked about the heroic structure. You mentioned that early on, and I was so impressed by that. I actually still have notes that I've kept from your keynote talks. And I wrote you a little note, just thank you so much. And you sent me this book. and it was like, oh my gosh, look what Davis Bunn sent me. And then it's got like not just an autograph, it's got like a letter inside. Like covering over there's 2 pages of it. I don't know where the second page went. But anyway, I just had to share that with you. Yeah, there's the second page. So it was like, you certainly became a hero to me when I received this in the mail, and it was such a surprise and such a sweet note and wishing me well in my writing journey. And then my historical is World War II, and it's based on the Nazi art looting and all of that. So of course I read The Amber Room and really enjoyed that novel that you've written. It was really fun.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you.
Best with your career. It's really sweet that you would mention that. I don't remember your note, but I do remember sending the book out, and
do you really?
Yeah, the note was just incredible. It was just so sweet.
Oh, thank you.
It wasn't enough just to say thanks.
No. I mean, it was really heartfelt, and it was such a sweet thing. So thank you just for taking time and telling us about the butler's flat and the murderous chef and tips on branding and the whole movie thing. This has been fantastic, and I just really appreciate it. So thank you. And for everybody, I hope you really enjoyed this interview. It's certainly going to be one of a kind, and welcome you back next week again on Novelists Unwind. Thank you. Bye-bye.